In 1970, I was walking through my hometown of Deal, and a road sweeper leant on his broom long enough to call to me, "Were you in the Navy?" When I said yes, he spoke one word, Dasher, and I knew in a flash that this was the face of the man leaning over a Carly raft and saying, "Come on, Tom," and pulled me in when I was all but done for.
Halfway between Ardrossan on the west coast of Scotland and Brodick on the Isle of Arran is the site of one of the greatest naval disasters in British home waters during the Second World War. On March the 27th, 1943, HMS Dasher, a hastily converted aircraft carrier, mysteriously exploded and sank within 8 minutes. Of the 528 men on board, only 149 survived. 379 lives were lost.
There was suddenly a big bang. The ship rolled over to starboard and stayed over for quite a long time.
Well, there's two terrible explosions. And up to way and it was 4 minutes.
When I hit the water, it was so cold. It puffed all the wind out of me.
When I came to the surface, the sea was covered in
I
oil.
swam 50 feet clear of the ship and turned to watch her dying moments.
Suddenly, with an enormous roar, the whole sea behind us and over us and above us went into flames.
400 lost. I was lucky. One of the lucky ones.
So few of the Fleet Air Arm personnel on board survived that 891 Squadron was disbanded shortly afterwards. Of the 379 who perished, only 23 were given an official burial. However, we know that some 3 times as many bodies, either brought ashore or washed up on local beaches and possibly burned beyond recognition, lie in unmarked plots. They were buried, in the words of the Admiralty, unobtrusively near the coast. To this day, no acknowledgement has been made of the number or the whereabouts of these unmarked graves. The lasting and callous secrecy has left hundreds of families not knowing what happened to their sons, brothers, relatives, or loved ones, and most have gone to their graves still not knowing. Dasher now lies upright in 550 feet of water, yet secrecy still surrounds the cause of her sinking. Even today, the Ministry of Defence refuses to release all of their records and continues to hinder efforts to establish the exact cause of her sinking. Had it not been for a chance encounter in 1992, the Ministry's attempts to cover up this disaster may well have succeeded.
I was walking down the main street in Ardrossan, and as I passed 3 senior citizens, I overheard the conversation. They were talking about a large ship that sank in local waters. I stopped and asked them the name of the ship, and they says they didn't know the name of the ship, but they could tell me it was in March 1943 and the ship was a Royal Naval vessel. I felt it was very, very sad, a very sad situation that lives should be lost in local waters and we knew nothing about it. So I started researching and looking up old newspapers and going to libraries. The libraries had nothing relating to HMS Dasher. I even visited the Mitchell Library in Glasgow and they had nothing. I then asked my local Member of Parliament, Brian Wilson, if he could assist me in finding out some information regarding HMS Dasher. Brian Wilson was very supportive and he said that he would get a researcher onto this in the House of Commons. 3 weeks later, a researcher phoned from the House of Commons asking me to confirm the name of the ship was HMS Dasher. I confirmed the name of the ship And the researcher said there is nothing recorded in the House of Commons documents relating to HMS Dasher.
This sparked John and his wife Noreen's curiosity, and they began 3 years of detailed research, which resulted in the publication of their book, The Tragedy of HMS Dasher. As word of the revelations in the book spread, they were contacted by many of the families affected by the tragedy. The book is now in its 3rd edition, and new facts are still beginning to emerge. An important new piece of information may explain the government's reluctance to release all of their records. There is a strong possibility that one of the bodies from Dasher was used in an operation to dupe the Germans about a possible invasion of Greece at a crucial time of the war in 1943. In the first few years of the Second World War, German U-boats were attacking Atlantic convoys carrying vital supplies from Canada and the United States. These convoys were protected by air cover from America, Iceland, and Britain. But the limited range of the available aircraft left a 300-mile-wide gap in mid-Atlantic. Here there was no effective protection against the German U-boats, and they struck almost at will. Ships were being lost faster than they could be replaced. It seemed that all the Germans had to do was to continue their U-boat attacks until Britain, without the supplies to continue the war or even feed her population, would eventually be forced to surrender. The only answer was to extend the range of air cover by building small aircraft carriers to escort the convoys. These could deploy planes to locate U-boats on the surface and sink them before they could submerge. This increased capability helped turn the tide of war in Britain's favor, enabling vital supplies to get across the Atlantic to feed the nation and arm her forces. So urgent was the need for these ships that cargo ships were converted into aircraft carriers in American dockyards in just 3 months. HMS Dasher was one of these carriers. She started her life as the cargo ship Rio de Janeiro. Launched in April 1942, she was converted later that year into an aircraft carrier in Brooklyn, New Jersey.
I went over with the first wave of officers to join the ship, who were required to be there for completion. At that time, our captain was to be Vice Admiral Bell Davis, VC, who had for his age a most extraordinary amount of vigour and go, kept us all on the hop, arranged with the shipyard that we shall all spend every day in the yard, free to go anywhere we wanted in the ship.
Dasher's maiden voyage was up to Canada to join a convoy bound for Liverpool. She only had one aircraft on board for anti-submarine patrols.
We had one swordfish for escort across the Atlantic, because there are no swordfish in America, so they got one across and put it on the Dasher, and we went off every morning, did the AS patrols, right across the Atlantic to arrive in Liverpool.
Dasher experienced some problems with her engines due to their unusual design, but she arrived safely in Liverpool for some additional equipment to be fitted and to take on a full crew ready for active service.
This was my first ship, of course, and eventually we set off on what was to be Operation Torch, the landings in North Africa.
Operation Torch was a combined American and British operation. General Patton commanded the Western Task Force, sailing directly from America to attack the Moroccan Atlantic ports. The Central Task Force, led by General Frednell, was to attack Oran, while the Eastern Force, led by General Ryder, was to attack Algiers. Dasher was one of the many aircraft carriers sent to provide air cover for the Allied landings, but she was not designed for the rigors of active service, and once again her engines gave trouble.
I looked at the ship's log and saw that it was down to 5 knots and falling, so the engines had stopped. So a quick call to the engine room, they suggest that's quite true, we had no engines and they didn't know when we would have any more again. They did manage to mend the engines, and about an hour and a half later we got power back. But we only had 2/3 of our full speed available.
After her repairs, Dasher was able to play her part in the Central Task Force's attack on Oran. The Vichy French forces offered little resistance to the Allies.
Just sailed up and down all day, flying aircraft off. But that mission was over really quite quickly. I spent most of the time in painting the transmitter room for the wireless, which was my branch. And that was my first taste of active life in the Royal Navy. We went back from there to Liverpool, nicely in time for Christmas.
In December 1942, Dasher's engines were repaired in Liverpool, and shortly after, she left for Iceland to join a Russian convoy.
We had an escort of 3 destroyers, and as we turned north, the gale, which was then blowing about force 8, increased to force 10, and it became hazardous. The captain refused to reduce the speed, although we left our destroyers miles behind, because he said it was vital that we got to Iceland on time. At about 1 a.m. we took a real Atlantic roller down the whole length of the flight deck, removing 2 aircraft which were secured on deck, and the captain then agreed to come down to 12 knots. Come the morning, it was discovered that the ship's side, on the port side opposite the island, was cracked from the top down to and well below the waterline. And that as the ship pitched, this crack was opening and shutting and allowing a large amount of water into the ship.
We ended up by moving into a fjord in Iceland, and we stayed there for about a week, flying aircraft off to look for any U-boats around, and returned from there down to Dundee for further repairs to this splits in the ship's side and so on.
When we got back from our leave in Dundee, it was to find that a new captain, Captain Boswell, was joining 2 days before we sailed to rejoin the fleet.
From Dundee, Dasher went to Rosyth for a further examination of her hull in dry dock, and once everything had been checked out, she sailed round to the Clyde.
On arrival at the Clyde, I think on the Friday morning, we embarked our aircraft and did a day's program, and then the next day, on the Saturday, we finished flying round about 4:45, and we were going to go into Lamlash Harbour in the Isle of Arran for the night. However, as we approached Lamlash, a signal came from the Admiral up at Greenock, saying that he wanted to meet our new captain, and we were therefore to go up to Greenock and spend the night there.
I remember most of all the captain's words on the tannoy when he said that we'd finished flying for the day, and those that were off duty would be able to go ashore over the weekend. He'd just finished this announcement, and I stood in the mess wondering whether I'd got time for a shower before Miss Muster's pay parade.
See, a lot of men, when the captain gave orders for the ship's company to get leave, they all went down below for shaving, and they're all caught below.
There was suddenly a big bang. The ship rolled over to starboard and stayed over for quite a long time.
I hit the deck running and got to the bridge within seconds, and as I arrived on the bridge looking out to starboard, I could see that the gun from the after sponson at the stern of the ship landing in the sea at about 100 yards away from the ship.
At the same time, John Lawson was serving on Dasher's sister ship, HMS Attacker, and he witnessed the events of that day.
We were returning upstream to Greenock. Dasher was ahead of us about a mile and a half, and we were roughly about the Holy Isle when there was this horrible explosion. And when we looked forward, there was this huge ball of smoke, and we realised that the Dasher had gone. We weren't sure what had happened, and were very apprehensive for our own safety, thinking that maybe a mine or maybe even torpedoed.
Reg Summerscales, then a naval signalman at Lamlash, received the last signal from HMS Dasher.
At approximately 1600 hours, she called up the signal station with a message for FOIC Greenock, repeated to NOIC Lamlash. Our expected time of arrival at the Taylor Bank Greenock would be at 1800 hours. I telephoned this message through to NOIC Lamlash for onward transmission to Greenock. After I put the phone down, I looked again at the Dasher, and a huge pile of smoke and flames had appeared from her stern, below the flight deck and into the quarterdeck. Immediately, the chief yeoman who was there with me at the time telephoned back to Lamlash to try and set up some effort to see if rescue boats were available if it was a real tragedy.
All the lights have gone out, of course. There were no emergency lights came on the mess deck. Of course, one didn't know what was happening, what had happened. But it seemed like a good idea to go up top. And that seemed a general consensus, go up to abandoned ship station, just in case.
It very soon became apparent, I would say within 1 to 2 minutes, that the ship was mortally wounded, and preparations would have to take place to abandon ship. A signal was made to the shore station reporting severely damaged by heavy explosion, require assistance, and hands were piped standby to abandon ship. The ship was rapidly losing forward movement, and within 4 minutes of the explosion she went past me going backwards at quite a speed and was obviously sinking by the stern. And it seemed to say to anybody watching that vast damage had been done at the after end of the ship by the explosion.
Due to it being Saturday afternoon, there would not be a lot of boats or ships available with the steam up, but there was few ships about who went to the Dasher at this time.
We immediately went to action stations. When it was realised that there would be survivors, we launched our wheelers and we picked up several survivors.
When I hit the water, it was so cold, it puffed all the wind out of me, and I kept going down and down. When I did surface, I was a long way from the ship, and by then there was just the classic bow section of the ship in view.
Once in the water, I swam 50 feet clear of the ship and turned to watch her dying moments. I saw the last aircraft break free from its lashings and slither down the deck.
Fortunately, it was still daylight, and for all those who had escaped the sinking, there was plenty of flotsam to help keep them afloat, and they could see many rescue ships approaching. It seemed only a matter of time before they would be saved, but they were soon dealt a cruel blow.
The sea started to effervesce, just like Andrew's or Eno's fruit salts, and with it a very, very strong smell of aviation spirit, which got very, very pungent.
Suddenly this aviation fuel ignited, and then the heavy diesel fuel also caught fire. Many of the survivors were burned alive as a 20-foot high wall of flame swept across the sea.
The ship must have been on fire when she went down. This bubbled up, there was raging fire and dense black smoke.
I just done the dog paddle for about 2 hours, and I was picked up by a coaster, and the coaster wouldn't come in any near us. She was afraid of fire, so I had to swim over to it.
Then I heard someone shout that a ship was coming. So I looked round and saw on the horizon the mast and outline of the top of a ship. So I swam away to meet her. And then I heard some unmistakable English nautical version from the gunnery officer who was in charge of lowering the ship's boat to pick up survivors. So I just trod water, waved and yelled, and they eventually dropped their boat and came and picked me up. Pulled me on board, and I asked if I could take an oar. It was a rowing boat after all. And that was agreed, and so I was able to row until we finally picked up all those we could and returned to the ship.
Every available ship, both naval and civilian, came to the rescue to bring ashore the survivors, the wounded, the dead and the dying. Barbara Kay was then a nurse serving with the Royal Naval Base at HMS Fortitude in Ardrossan.
I was on duty at sick bay. About 5 o'clock we heard a loud bang. After that a call came through, and the call was that to expect wounded and burned from a ship, no name mentioned. Shortly after that, or I should say immediately after that, Harry Judd, the ambusman, left to go to the harbour HMS Ardrossan.
This is where the many rescue ships docked, where shocked survivors, the badly wounded, and the deceased were brought ashore. They were met by a fleet of ambulances called in from all over the area, parked nose to tail along the quay and all the way up the main street of Ardrossan. The wounded were taken to the Royal Naval Sick Bay, and from there the seriously injured were taken to local hospitals for further treatment.
Only one could not be moved, and that was William MacDonald. He had 3rd-degree burns. The skin was all off him. His cherry red colour, charred with blisters, and it was so sad to see him. This one really fought to live, but didn't make it.
The next day was a Sunday, and it was very foggy, and I remember thinking that if in fact the weather had been similar at that particular time, well, there would have been very few survivors. And we spent the day in groups being taken down to the local barracks to view more bodies to see if we could identify them. Not a very pleasant day.
Some of the boys who had passed away, who had died that night, there was one officer I'll never forget who was brought in. He was put into the laundry room, and I happened to go through at the time to put some of the clothes that had been taken off the survivors. And he lay there, and I looked at him. I said a prayer, and I said to him, "You're some mother's son, but I'll never forget you. I'll always remember you."
On Wednesday, they arranged the funeral. It just gave them time to try and rustle up bits of uniform for us to make us look reasonably presentable for the occasion. So we lined up 3 thick, as usual, in columns, and as I was tall, I was in the front rank and led the procession behind the lorries carrying the coffins. I recall in particular, as we passed one of the schools there, the whole school was out assembled and flag flying at past, and it was the most touching sight to me that they'd come out to pay homage in this way.
From the bottom of Glasgow Street to the cemetery, it was a slow march all the way.
It was a terrible occasion. I was of course only 19 at the time. The strains of the Dead March from Seoul will haunt me forever.
The official Board of Enquiry was convened 3 days after the sinking. It lasted 2 days. 604 questions were asked of survivors from HMS Dasher to ascertain what caused that ship to sink. The conclusion of the Board of Enquiry was that the ship sank due to an internal explosion causing damage below the waterline. There was no mention of the captain of the ship, Captain L.A.K. Boswell, and there was no mention of the most senior officer on board the ship, Lieutenant Philip Coolmer, DSO, the ship's navigating officer. Both these senior officers were not present at the 2-day Board of Enquiry. This is the first time in Royal Navy history that the captain has never been requested to attend the Board of Enquiry. Why was the captain not asked to come to the Board of Enquiry, and why was the ship's navigating officer not requested to attend the Board of Enquiry?
This was just part of a veil of secrecy which has surrounded HMS Dasher ever since. Rescuers, survivors and witnesses, everyone with any knowledge of what befell Dasher in these waters, all were sworn to secrecy.
The signal was passed to the fleet that this incident was never to be mentioned.
We were told not to repeat anything we had seen or heard that particular afternoon.
In wartime, you weren't allowed to speak about what happened. Everything was kept secret.
A lot of people lost their families, their sons, and they didn't know what had happened.
The vow of silence that had been imposed on us at the sinking left its mark, I'm sure, on all of us.
Perhaps during wartime this could be accepted on the grounds of national security, but it was not until 1972 that some of the Dasher files were placed in the Public Records Office at Kew, and even then there were no press announcements and none of the relatives were informed. Despite the records being released, there still remains the fact that only 23 bodies were officially buried. What became of those who were brought ashore and the many who floated ashore? The Commonwealth War Graves Commission say they can provide no further details. Perhaps one of the reasons why the government refuses to release all of their records is that there is a strong possibility that one of the bodies from Dasher was used in an operation to fool the Germans about a possible invasion of Greece at a crucial time of the war in 1943. In late 1942, Allied forces were advancing from their successful campaign in North Africa to invade Germany. Sicily commanded a significant strategic position in the Mediterranean, but was under German occupation. Any invasion would have resulted in massive troop losses, so it was essential to convince the Germans that Greece, not Sicily, would be the center of the Allied forces' invasion. A top-secret military intelligence team, the 20 Committee, met to discuss ways of deceiving the Germans. Operation Mincemeat was launched in late 1942 under the command of Lieutenant Commander Ewan Montague. Their plan was to float a body ashore near the Spanish town of Huelva on the Mediterranean coast where a high-level German spy was known to be active. The body was to be outfitted as a major in the Royal Marines and would be carrying top-secret documents to indicate the Allies intended to invade Greece. The identity of the man was chosen as Major William Martin, and all relevant identity documents were created. The body was to be taken by submarine to Huelva and released when the inshore tides were most favorable. It was a desperate plan, but if it worked, it could change the course of the war, so all efforts were made to find a suitable body. As it was almost certain that the body would receive a thorough post-mortem, it was essential that the right body was found. It had to be unmarked and show signs of death by drowning. According to official records, a suitable body was located in February 1943 and kept in cold storage until all the details of Operation Mincemeat could be finalized. On April the 15th, 1943, Winston Churchill gave his approval for Operation Mincemeat to commence, and by April the 30th, submarine Seraph was lying off the Spanish port of Huelva on an incoming tide. The body had been transported in a sealed container and kept preserved with dry ice. In the corpse's possession were authentic everyday items: loose change, keys, matches and cigarettes, even letters from his supposed father and solicitor, together with more personal ones from his fiancée. Chained to his wrist was a locked diplomatic bag containing top-secret documents about an invasion of the Greek islands, including letters from Lord Louis Mountbatten and General Eisenhower. With everything in place, the body was placed in the water at 4:30 a.m. to float ashore on an incoming tide. It was given an initial start by the swirl of the submarine's propellers as she headed back to the UK. At 9:30 the same morning, a local fisherman found the body and briefcase. The Spanish authorities were informed, and a post-mortem was carried out by pathologist Eduardo del Torno at Huelva Mortuary. His conclusion was that the man had fallen into the sea whilst still alive, and death was by drowning. He indicated that the body had been in the water between 3 and 5 days. The body of Major Martin was buried the next day in Huelva Cemetery, and a hastily inscribed headstone showing his false identity was erected shortly afterwards. Meanwhile, the documents in the briefcase were carefully opened, copied, and resealed before being returned to the British Vice-Consul. The copies were sent to the head of German intelligence, who accepted them as genuine and informed Hitler of their contents. The result was an immediate plan, instigated from the highest level, for the withdrawal of troops from Sicily. On July the 10th, 1943, British, Canadian and American forces invaded Sicily. 153,000 men swarmed ashore from over 1,100 vessels and caught the diminished German forces by surprise. A short, intense battle followed, leading to an Allied victory with only light casualties. Operation Mincemeat had been a complete success and marked a major turning point in the war. After the war, in 1951, Montague was urged to hastily write a book about the operation to quash rumors that were mounting as to the true identity of the body. His book, The Man Who Never Was, went on to become an international bestseller. But far from putting the record straight, it raised more questions than it answered and gave no evidence as to the true identity of the body. Montague did, however, confirm that he and a colleague, Jock Horsfall, had driven the body in its sealed container from London to the Clyde to rendezvous with the submarine Seraph. At the time of publishing, not much attention was paid to these facts. It now appears that this journey had another purpose which Montague did not reveal. They planned to switch the body for one of those from Dasher. The allegedly true identity of the body was only revealed over 53 years later in 1996 as that of Glyndŵr Michael, a down-and-out who was apparently depressed and had died of pneumonia after drinking rat poison. He died in January 1943, and his body was kept in cold storage until Operation Mincemeat could be launched. These details were released by the Public Records Office in Kew, again without any publicity whatsoever. For 55 years, the grave of Major Martin lay in witheld Cemetery, and the gravestone was only altered in 1998 to reveal the apparently true identity. But despite the release of these official records, major doubts still remain, and new research has shown almost conclusively that the true identity has still not been revealed. The official version about the body used contains several inconsistencies. Firstly, it is highly unlikely that the body of an undernourished vagrant, especially one who had died of pneumonia after drinking poison, would fool any experienced pathologist. Bill Haggerty was a practicing solicitor for 51 years and studied forensic medicine at Glasgow University.
I couldn't quite see how they were going to use the body of possibly an undernourished and maybe an alcoholic tramp to represent the body of a mid-30s Marine major who would obviously be in reasonably fit condition. And it occurred to me that any competent pathologist would soon look at the body and say, well, he is undernourished. It might well be that his liver is cirrhosed. This isn't a Marine major.
The events leading up to Operation Mincemeat revealed perhaps the most convincing clues to date that the body used was in fact one of those drowned when HMS Dasher sank on March the 27th. With the timing of Operation Mincemeat becoming critical, Montague knew that a refrigerated body would only be usable for up to 3 months. Any later than that, and physical deterioration would become obvious. The news of drowned bodies of fit naval men being washed ashore at Ardrossan gave Montague his best chance of success, but no mention of this was made in his book. Why would the submarine Seraph have been ordered to sail from Blythe, on the northeast coast of England, right round the north coast of Scotland and down the west coast to the Clyde, to pick up a body which had been stored in London for over 2 months and was suddenly driven by van at night over 500 miles up to the Clyde? It seems an amazing coincidence that the chosen rendezvous was exactly where freshly drowned bodies were coming ashore, having been in the water between 3 and 5 days. It seems almost conclusive that the submarine Seraph sailed round to the Clyde to pick up a body from Dasher and to ensure that Operation Mincemeat was the total success it turned out to be. Yet the government still seem reluctant to provide us with the real truth. It seems incredible in today's media-driven world that such secrecy could be perpetuated. But in 1943 the world was a very different place. So what exactly did happen to HMS Dasher on that day in 1943 to make a 500-foot ship displacing 8,200 tons sink in just 8 minutes? Was it, as the Board of Enquiry hastily concluded at the time, an explosion caused by aviation fuel? Was it, as was claimed after the war when the news was released, an aircraft crashing in between decks? Was it a German mine or torpedo? Was it even the accidental firing of a torpedo, an event not unknown at the time? Or was it something else the Board of Enquiry had completely overlooked? Sabotage. Just days before the disaster, while Dasher was undergoing repairs at Dundee, an unidentified visitor made off with the keys to the ship's bomb rooms.
We found that there was no sign of these keys. We then examined the magazine log, and found that somebody illegibly had signed for the bomb room key and the bomb room handling room key at about 2 o'clock that afternoon. So we sent for the keyboard sentry of the afternoon watch, and he said, "Oh yes sir, I remember, he was a nice gentleman in plain clothes," and he said that he and the engineer officer had something to do in the bomb room, and the engineer officer had asked him to draw the keys on the way. So we then decided we had to institute a search, and the Master-at-Arms and ship's police were sent for, and they then, about half an hour later, discovered the missing keys tucked down behind some ventilating trunking in the bomb handling room. And that was the end of that. And I reported all this to the captain before going back to bed, and he said, we'll have to look into that tomorrow. For some reason we never did.
The Navy completed a full underwater survey of the wreck in 1982, yet the results of their findings are still being kept secret by the Ministry of Defence under the 30-year rule. Perhaps their decision to refuse access to the wreck might be explained by a further possible reason for the sinking: friendly fire. At the time, such terminology would have been unheard of, but as recent conflicts in the Gulf have shown, friendly fire is a real and ever-present danger. So could it be possible that Dasher was sunk by a British torpedo? The Clyde, after all, was used extensively for submarine training. The ministry denied there was any submarine activity in the area at the time, but new research has shown that the training ship Isle of Sark was exercising in the vicinity with a British submarine. Another vessel, La Capricieuse, was also involved in an exercise with a British submarine just 4 or 5 miles from Dasher. Furthermore, just 5 months after Dasher sank, a torpedo was fired by mistake just 20 miles north at the small town of Sandbank near Dunoon on the Cowell Peninsula. As it passed through the water, local fishermen saw its white wake and watched in amazement as it struck the shore and exploded, leaving shattered windows in nearby homes and a huge crater large enough to hold 2 buses. Fortunately, no lives were lost. But what if an aircraft carrier had been in its path? What if the same thing had happened with a torpedo being fired southwards just 5 months previously? This would explain the strict veil of secrecy which the government has maintained ever since the loss of Dasher. It is understandable that in time of war, news of such a disaster should be kept secret from the Germans, yet, even now, over 60 years later, the government seems determined to conceal the truth, perhaps in the hope that they can delay the final revelation until all of the immediate families have passed on. Fortunately, for those still living, the revelations in John and Noreen Steele's book have led to several memorial plaques being placed in Ardrossan, as well as a commemorative book in the local museum containing a roll call of all those lost. The most important plaque is at the Dasher Memorial Garden on the seafront at Ardrossan, and here a special service is held each year. The 60th anniversary of the loss of HMS Dasher saw the largest gathering of survivors and relatives. After a poignant remembrance service, wreaths were laid for all those lost. The following day, the Ardrossan to Brodick ferry made a short detour from its scheduled route and stopped over the site of Dasher. After a short service on board, survivors and relatives had an opportunity to cast wreaths and floral tributes on the water over the wreckside. The loss of HMS Dasher and 379 young lives is still not fully understood by those affected.
Frank was lost with many others, 379. And we heard from the Admiralty that he was missing. A few months after, we got another message saying he was missing, believed killed, and that is the only information we ever got. It was never confirmed that he was actually killed. He was just missing, believed killed. My mother who was in the house on her own when the telegram came, she never was the same woman after. She was outgoing, jolly, smiling before, but part of her died on that day, and she never ever recovered from the loss, and she died in 1956. For the British to keep up this secrecy for all this time is ridiculous. I mean, all the people, all the parents have all died without knowing why their sons died, how their sons died, where they died. And it's a thing that personally I can't forgive this country for. My father always said that the loss of his arm in the last month of the First World War was nothing compared to the loss of his son, and even worse was not knowing the reason for the loss. He never forgave this country for what they did, and I won't either.
After all these research, discussing this terrible tragedy with the relatives, having great communication with the MOD, with the Cabinet Office, much with great support from Brian Wilson, my Member of Parliament. After all this time, surely now is the time for someone at Whitehall to put their hand up and tell us why the secrecy, why were the relatives never told, and what happened to that ship.
Mystery still surrounds the sinking, the unmarked graves, and the true identity of Major Martin. Perhaps, when all the facts have been revealed, they can finally be laid to rest.
On the 27th day of March, 1943, Dasher left Lochranza. She'd come round from Dundee. She was heading for an anchorage just north at Greenock town, when a bloody great explosion took the Dasher down. In the middle of the channel known as the Firth of Clyde, the spot the Dasher sank in is as deep as it is wide. She lies there still, a war grave in the water deep and cold. And yet for years the families were never ever told. They were not told, never told. Those of her crew who did not drown, their fate was worst of all. For burning fuel had turned the sea into a fireball, and the cries of stricken sailors as they struggled to survive soon faded into silence as one by one they died. Yet it was not German action that ended Dasher's days. It seems a simple accident sent her beneath the waves. Almost 400 young men lost the chance of growing old, and yet for years the families were never ever told. They were not told, never told. Then a rumour started someone was heard to say that the body of a sailor lad who lost his life that day had been taken by the government to further Britain's cause. To fool Hitler they invented the man who never was. Did that sailor from the Dasher help the Allies win the war? The answer still lies hidden in some secret Whitehall drawer, and still the nation's waiting for the whole truth to unfold. Someday they'll have to tell us all what the families were not told. They were not told, never told. A government decision was taken right away. No one should ever talk about what happened